So, welcome to another episode of the Rediscovery channel, where each week my friends Ivor and myself, Stilgar, we look at a different topic, and the idea is to rediscover history together this way. And Ivor, this week I want to talk about somebody. If I mention Vladimir, is there anybody you think of, Vladimir?
Yeah, I think of Vladimir Putin, and I
Any?
also think of there's a medieval guy like Vladimir, one of the Tsars, right?
Yes, and I actually want to talk about him, which he was Vladimir the Great.
Okay.
And yeah, the reason I want to talk to him is I don't know that much about Slavic history. I know a little bit because we did a one episode about Harold Hardrada, who traveled down to Kiev Rus and to flee his own country, and then he was with the Varangian Guard for a while in Byzantine. And then he came back and he became the king of Norway, and he also had a role to play in the Battle of Hastings, or right before it, rather. But this is actually about, and the two stories are related. Vladimir the Great. He was born in the year 958, and he was the son and the youngest son of Sviatoslav of Kiev. I'm probably butchering that name,
I've
but in
heard of
his,
Sviatoslav before.
yeah,
Uh,
and
this is the
he,
Kiev Rus period.
yes, yeah. So he played an important role actually in bringing down the two empires next to him, which I think were the Bulgari and the Khazaris, if I'm not mistaken. And
Khazars.
yeah, but are they Khazars or are they Khazari? Because I found some stuff about that they supposedly adopted Judaism, but that's
Yes.
a whole nother story, right? So
Yeah,
anyway,
and actually, that's why a lot of Russian Jews are considered suspect. And I don't know if this is true, but I heard in Israel that like Russian Jews are considered like the lowest or among the lowest because the other people doubt whether or not their lineage is legitimate. So,
okay, okay,
yeah, a little bit of
yeah.
something.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed listening to two Ukrainian Jews online, which is Lex Fridman and Michael Malice. But anyway, they have two podcasts that I like to listen to. They're pretty
Hmm.
intelligent guys, and one of them is an anarchist, and the other one has some sympathy apparently for Putin, which is interesting as well. And so does his a lot of his family.
I heard
But
Putin is pro-Jewish. I don't know if that's true or not. But
yes, I believe so. I think he actually paid for his one of his teachers' pension in Israel, like his apartment. That was one of his nannies. I'm pretty sure, but yeah. Anyway, so yeah, the Kiev Rus, right? So this is people that are kind of at the foundation of what are now the Russians and the Slavs. And Vladimir the Great, he became the Great for an important reason, and also a saint for an important reason, namely that he at one point adopted Christianity, and um, and there's an interesting story about that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
I think I might know this story. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so he was born of Sviatoslav and his housekeeper Malusha. And Malusha is described in the Norse sagas as a prophetess who lived to be 100 years old and was brought from her cave to the palace to predict the future. Anyway,
Cave.
yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah. But the thing is, Malusha, so he had a northern or Norse background,
Uh-huh.
and he was raised by her and her brother mostly, and which means that basically this guy Vladimir, he was basically a Norseman, so a Varangian, and
Yeah, they
that's
were,
that's
but
the
then
way he lived his life. Also, like he loved fighting battles. Um, well, anyway, throughout his life. But what were you going to say? Sorry about that.
I was gonna say, no, it's all right. I was just gonna say they were, but then they adopted like Slavic naming conventions, so they kind of assimilated into the people that they conquered.
They did, yeah, and quite quickly actually. And
Like the
that's
Normans.
the Normans did as well in France, and so did the Norsemen, I guess, in or the Varangians in when it comes to Kievan Rus. And they took over the naming conventions, but there were still historic ties because at one point Vladimir had to flee because it was between him and his two brothers, and he was the youngest of three, and he was, an illegitimate child. And the two brothers were fighting each other, where one brother killed the other. I think it was Oleg, who was killed by, let me see in my notes, Yaropolk. I'm probably not saying that right. Anyway, so yeah,
sound familiar. Yeah.
So he actually has to flee to the north. I think it's Norway or Sweden, and he's briefly with Håkon Sigurdsson, ruler of Norway. So yeah, Norway anyway. And being there, he collects a group of furious Norse warriors that then assist him to recover Novgorod on his return. And then he marched against Yaropolk, the brother that had killed Oleg, and successfully took over. So he took over what is nowadays Kiev, or the Ukraine, and as well as that's the capital, as well as larger parts of Russia, Poland, Lithuania, as well as Finland. So there are all these different Slavic tribes that were part of the Proto-Russian, and Rus refers to a location in Sweden. Because they were united by these Norse conquerors who would sail down the Danube River and all the way down to the Byzantines, and would kind of raid there, but also rule, and started this Kievan Rus Empire.
Did you hear the myth about how the Kiev Rus came to be in charge?
No.
Supposedly, the different Slavic tribes were constantly fighting each other. So they actually invited the Vikings to come down in and rule over them in order to...
yeah. I wonder if that's actually true.
I think not.
Like I said, I read about this for several hours, but we are, anyway, I'm an amateur here, so I'm sure there are listeners that have a lot more to say, but this is the general story of Vladimir, right? So he was still very much pagan, and he was able to expand his territories beyond his father's domain. So he would conquer the Chervan towns from the Poles in 981, 982. He suppressed the Sviatoslav rebellion. These are all Slavic tribes. He subdued the Yatvingians. He conquered the Radimiks. And then in 985, he conducted a military campaign against the Volga Bulgars, which were Muslim Bulgars, by the way.
They're Muslims?
Yeah.
That I haven't heard. Okay.
So he planted numerous fortresses and colonies on his way. And even though Christianity was spreading, he was a pagan. And he had 800 concubines, along with numerous wives. And he actually erected pagan statues in Kiev and shrines to the gods. And there he had the deities for the Norse gods, the Slavic gods, and I believe he even had some for the Iranian gods, because I think there were some ties as well through the Scythians or Scythians, however you say that.
Yes.
And some Slavic tribes as well. So
that's right. The Slavs and the Aryan cultures, Indo-Aryans and Persians and Scythians, they're all the same. They all belong to the same haplogroup. And if you compare like the Slavs or some of them, they had this tradition of these two gods like Chernobog and Belobog, which is it means like black god and white god. In other words, good guy and bad guy. And it's the Zoroastrian tradition. They have Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, which is kind of the same thing. So yeah, there's definitely some overlap, between them. And the reason it's not so much of a contiguous group today is because of the influence of Islam and also because of the Turkish conquests, all those Turkish nomads that came out and streaked all the way across the steppes and pretty much severed Eastern Europe from the remaining Iranic cultures. But anyways, go ahead. Sorry, my bad.
No, that's fine. So Christianity was spreading, but there was actually a lot of persecution of Christians within the Kiev Russian Empire. And there are some saints like Fyodor and Loan or Lone. They had, I think they desecrated some pagan deities or statues, and because of that there was like a lot of persecution as well. Or
Didn't
anyway,
somebody take an axe to one of the wooden statues?
I think that may have been Fyodor. So anyway, that probably didn't help.
No.
But also like there were like all the deities were there. And Prince Vladimir had them all except for the Christian god. So that was interesting. And he apparently he fought often about this persecution. It made an impact on him, but in a different way than people might think. So he also started to realize that the way forward was monotheistic for trade relations, but also because that was like all the religious. It was turning into monotheism everywhere. And he knew that this was also going to be the way forward for his Kiev Rus empire. And he sent out envoys throughout the civilized world to have a first-hand look at the major religions of the time: Islam, Roman Catholicism, Judaism, and the Byzantine Orthodoxy. And apparently, the chronicle goes that he didn't like Judaism because he thought that God had abandoned the Israelis because they lost Jerusalem. And then when he visited the Muslim Bulgars, which is part of them, right? Because they weren't all Muslim, but he said the envoy said that there was no joy among those people. He thought they thought they were barbarians, and plus they outlawed the drinking of alcohol and eating of pork. And the drinking of alcohol is like the main or one of the main ways of enjoying themselves for
The
the
great
Rus.
joy of the Russian people, right?
Yeah. so that's so that was interesting. And then they visited the Catholics in Germany, but they thought they weren't impressed by the churches. They thought they were too boring. And then they went to Byzantine, and then the envoy said that they weren't sure whether they were on heaven or on earth. That's how much they were impressed with the religious ceremony that they attended there. And maybe as you remember from the Hardrada episode, is that they would use all these machinations using steam and all kinds of things to really put up to put up a show, basically.
Yeah, and they also did that in the emperor's throne room. Like they had mechanical birds that would sing in the trees, and
that wasn't part of the religious service, of course, but they were just so impressed with how beautiful it was. So that was the religion that he took over. And then what followed was a time where basically he consolidated the empire, and he no longer expanded anymore. He lived in relative peace with his neighbors, except for the Petchev, I think, Turks that lived to the east, which he considered a threat, and he kind of just attacked them to keep them out from attacking Kiev. And he slowly but surely started converting major cities, smaller towns, for the most part through peaceful means. And at some point, he ended up marrying. Let's see, I think it was the sister, yes, of Basil II, which was the emperor of the Greek Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. And one of the conditions also was that he would have to convert to Christianity, or to the Byzantine religion. It's not known what he did with his other wives and with his concubines, but he married a 27-year-old princess, and apparently he spent a lot of time. He became like his religious counselor, and he spent a lot of time like building churches, as attending to the poor, and also traveling to parts of the country where he normally wouldn't have traveled. And he ended up dying of old age. And in return, actually, for the sister of Basil II, he sent over his troops, his Varangian troops, and this is how the Varangian Guard started. So they were sent over to help assist Basil II in fighting an insurrection, and in return. And they kind of stuck around there and starting the Varangian Guard that would last for hundreds of years, and which would later be joined by Harald Hardrada as he fled from Norway to stay with the son of Vladimir the Great and find refuge there before moving on to Byzantine, and then later taking back the Norwegian throne. So yeah, that's the story I wanted to talk about this week, Vladimir the Great. And I enjoyed reading up on some of the Slavic tribes and the Western, Eastern tribes, and also about some of the conflict that's happening today, which is interesting because it looks like at one point they were one people. And now you have, of course, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. But a lot has happened since, and I think if you look at the Ukrainian history specifically, which they are Eastern Slavs, similar to the Russians.
Yeah,
but they were also like part of the Ottoman Empire. They were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. They were then part of the Tsarist Russia. They were part of the Soviet Union, where they suffered through the Holodomor. So, which is another topic altogether. But millions of Ukrainians were killed through hunger under Stalin. But it's an interesting history to see, where in the place where the next big conflict might take place actually in the world. So yeah.
Yeah, I believe that the difference between Ukrainians and Russians, because of course Kiev was the original capital. The difference between Ukrainians and Russians, I'm pretty sure it started after the Mongols came and they conquered the eastern areas, and those people became the Russians. Like they were part of the Golden Horde, and there were different. I actually took a class on this when I was in college, Russian history, but there were different local rulers that the Mongols would set to be in charge, and one of them was Moscow, and eventually, like the Moscow, the kingdom or the duchy of Moscow just got more and more powerful, and then it overwhelmed the others, and it got to the point where they just decided not to pay tribute to the Mongols anymore. And so the Mongols lined up all their forces to go to battle, and then the Russians lined up their forces on the other side, and they met, but then they just decided to not bother with fighting each other, and that was the end of it. I need to just confirm that, but I'm 90% sure that's the case.
Yeah,
So
apparently, if you look nowadays, Belarus, um, which is a country to the north of the Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah, it is.
and it also borders Russia, is actually closest when it comes to language. Although Ukrainian and Russian are not that far apart either.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it's an interesting part. Um, some of Vladimir's legacy is he built a lot of churches and defensive positions. I'll include some pictures in the video. Saint Vladimir's Cathedral is one of the largest cathedrals in Kiev. It's
Still around.
dedicated to him. And there's a Russian order of Saint Vladimir. And yeah, anyway, and the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches still celebrate the feast of Saint Vladimir on July 15th every year. So yeah, interesting guy.
Yeah.
Well,
So I do remember that story about the Kiev Rus converting, like the reason or the way that they converted to the Eastern Orthodox faith, why they selected it, but I didn't remember the name of the ruler. So.
And I'm pretty sure they moved to the Slavic version of the church later on, which is using the Slavic old Slavic text versus the Greek text, which makes sense. So
Cyrillic.
Yeah, which I think it also happened to Bulgaria, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So
yeah, their text actually was given to them by some Byzantine Orthodox missionary. The Cyrillic text. I guess they didn't have any text beforehand, or maybe they did, but I know probably not. But I know the Vikings, they had runes, but usually when they converted to Christianity, they switched to the Latin-based system of writing. They abandoned their runes.
Yeah. So yeah, I need to learn more about about them. I was going to do something about the history between the Ukraine and Russia, which I might still do, but it's a super complex topic, and I don't want to present some kind of one-sided picture. But there's many different factions, and there's there's so much history there, and also there's this part about the Cossacks, and they have like this proto version of democracy, which is very interesting as well. It's probably worth another topic in itself. But yeah, I enjoyed reading up on some of the Vladimir the Great and some of the Varangians again, and the Kiev Rus, which is an interesting part of the world where a lot is happening right now. So who knows?
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that's happening now, though, doesn't really need to happen. I think it's mostly just overblown. And I know one thing that I know for a fact is when the Soviet Union broke apart, they drew the borders for Ukraine through ethnic Russian territories. So they tried to give the government of Ukraine more land. I mean, not obviously they don't have more land than Russia, but land which goes beyond the places where Ukrainians live. So they gave them more land, and the Russians that are there, however, are a minority, so they can't really have any influence over the politics. So that's one reason why they want to go and have their own separate country. They don't like it's balkanization. Right?
It's also like there's if you look at the western part of the country, the language, the Ukrainian language, is more like Polish apparently. And then if you go to the middle, it becomes more and more Russian. And then towards the east, it's pretty much Russian, the language.
Yeah, towards the east, it's Russian because they drew the new borders through Russian territory. So obviously, when you do things like that, it's going to be a problem later on. Just like in Africa, you have like a lot of fighting in Africa because the borders of the countries are drawn around multiple ethnic groups, some of which are traditional, like ancient enemies that hate each other, and also, not speak languages that are not even mutually intelligible or, less related to each other than Russians and Ukrainians. And a lot of people complain about Africa and say it's so bad that the borders were drawn that way. But then, the same thing happened in Europe to some extent too, like with Ukraine And also you have like Spain, where there's at least 3 different ethnic groups. You got the Basque, you've got the Catalonians, and then you have like regular Spanish people that actually speak Spanish, and they're the majority. So
Yeah, and if you
anyway,
look at the current conflict, I think if you there were some concessions made to Gorbachev during the Glasnost, and when Eastern Germany, when the wall fell, they were making some concessions from the side of NATO, the US, to the Soviet Union at the time about expansion of NATO. But then if you look at a list today of some of the NATO countries, it includes a lot of these former Soviet Union's states that are now part of NATO, like Slavic countries, like Poland, like let's see who else. I think it was Hungary.
Hungary is not Slavic though.
Yeah, Macedonia was one of them. There's which is also like Greek Slavic, but they're what they said is like, well, we won't move east. NATO, but they did massively. And then there's, of course, now there's talk about including Ukraine in NATO as well. And
that's going to be upsetting to
yeah, well, I
the
mean,
Russians.
like it's not black and white, and there's reasons for them to join NATO. But then again, like
I think
it's
NATO has
also from the
outlived its. I think NATO has
yeah, it's
outlived its
probably outlived its
usefulness.
purpose. Yeah,
Like the whole point of NATO was when the Soviet Union was there and it was gobbling up all sorts of other countries. It was to have a mutual defense pact, something to do to stop this horde, basically. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, that doesn't make any sense. Like, okay, a mutual defense pact against what? Like, the economy of Russia is actually the same size as the economy of Italy. The thing that Russia has, though, is a lot of nukes. But as long as you don't provoke them, then there's no reason for it to come to that. So I just
yeah. Yeah, I also understand that they, how the Ukraine, with its history, would want to be part of NATO and feel safer that way, and how a lot of people want to turn west and become
yeah,
part of the EU because it's richer and there's more money to be made there, and they want to modernize and things like that. So I do understand that as well. But then again, like I also understand the Russian side of, so it's like two ways, and there's a lot of history there. It's very complex, and sometimes I think it does, like comparisons don't make sense oftentimes because this is a unique situation. But then again, like sometimes it can be helpful if you zoom out a little bit and just look at all the different situations there, and look at like, okay, well, how would like it's not exactly the same, but how would the US feel if Russia started building bases in Mexico?
that's
Yeah.
actually that's right. Like they tried to build a base. They did like that was a concern during the last century. Like they built a base in Cuba and they were going to put nuclear missiles there. We almost got into a war with them over that when Kennedy was president. So it's kind of hypocritical, for our government to be so concerned about the frontier of Ukraine when they're not, like, number one, those people aren't doing anything to us, and number two, they're not at all concerned with our own borders and security. Like I
Like
think it all just
I
needs to
understand
stop.
the Ukrainian perspective. I understand the Russian perspective. I don't understand why this is so important to the US, other than just to divert from other topics potentially, because like the Ukraine is like 60 million people. It's not very rich. It's very poor actually.
I'll
So
tell you the truth.
I don't
Most
understand. Like, there's no real threat from Russia to the U.S.
There
Or
isn't.
Western Europe, really. So why are they so yeah, willing to go to these extremes? But yeah, anyway.
So one thing that is most people in the United States don't care about the Russia and Ukraine conflict, and honestly, most people can't even find Ukraine on a map. Like if you say Ukraine, they probably think of a bird. So it's entirely an artificial thing that doesn't have anything to do with the average person. So
Yeah,
Anybody who
it's very
oversees,
dangerous potentially to the US compared to like messing around in like Libya or Iraq or
oh,
Afghanistan. This is like a whole different magnitude.
oh,
But
for sure.
yeah,
Yeah, because
yeah,
they have more nuclear missiles than we do. They,
they
even
do.
if
Yeah,
like
and
half
even their
their,
conventional army is like yes, their economy is tiny, but even their conventional army is capable. Like they have some highly capable high tech weaponry that could wreak havoc. To be honest,
well, even
So
if half of their nuclear missiles were to miss, that's still more than enough to turn our whole country into a radioactive wasteland.
well, they could blow
So
up their own country, and the whole world would basically turn into a radioactive.
wasteland, yeah,
Yeah,
or at least the whole northern hemisphere.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, but that's not thanks to Vladimir the Great and Vladimir the Saint, who lived an epic life and yeah, died of old age in the end. Um, but yeah, so cool dude, I think, and interesting. All those ties to the Scandinavians they had back then, which I find it very interesting. So
Yeah, they just kind of overwhelmed people and became the ruling class, even though they were a minority. It seems to be like a repeating pattern. They come to be in charge, and people are like, okay, I guess. I wonder, I have a theory. Like maybe the reason that people accepted these Viking rulers is because once they did that, then they didn't have to worry about Viking raids anymore.
yeah, potentially, and apparently the Slavs had some warrior culture as well. So there may have it may have been that they just had a lot in common. But yeah. Anyway,
So,
cool. So with that, I want to close this one out. Ivor, thanks for your good questions, and hope I didn't bore anybody with my amateur analysis. I think it's a really cool topic. I'll put some links in the description. We keep reading on about Vladimir the Great and the Russians or the Kiev Russians, and hopefully with that, we'll see you in the next video. All right.
great.